What's up guys, I'm BTC. Recently there was a new game mode that allowed for role queue with 1 tank, 3 DPS, and 2 supports. Unfortunately, it seems like kind of the popular thing to just say it's bad, because that's what you expect people want to hear, but you guys know better than that when it comes to me. I try to be the most honest and neutral outlook in any of these new changes. I've spent a decent amount of time trying out this new game mode, as well as reviewing lots of footage from other players. So this video will hopefully give you a better understanding of all the good and bad in this mode, but also give some feedback to Blizzard and suggest some possible improvements. I will be going over each character in the tank role individually, but first I want to talk about the new system in more general terms. Couple of things I noticed right away. While the queue time for DPS player has dropped quite a bit, the queue time for tank players has gone up considerably. I'm not overly concerned about this right now for a couple of reasons. The first thing to keep in mind is, whenever there has been significant changes to a character, a lot of people want to try out the new stuff. This means that you have a lot of people trying to queue for the tank role who normally wouldn't play tank. It's just like when you get a new character. Everyone wants to try out that new hero, even if it's something they wouldn't normally play. Also, keep in mind that most people are probably still playing quick play in the normal competitive ladder, which means that the people trying out the new experimental mode are more likely going to be the players who want to try out the new stuff. So, short version, yes, the queue times have gone up, but I don't think it would be nearly as bad if it was put into a regular competitive mode, so as I said, for right now, I'm not overly worried about it. As far as being the only tank on the team, I know one of the concerns was that there might be too much pressure, but I didn't really see that being an issue. I found the new game mode to be pretty exciting, and as the only tank player, you get to control a lot more of what's going on. For example, if you're playing as Reinhardt in a 2-2-2 and the other tank decides to pick, let's say, Hammond, then you're going to be at a significant disadvantage against the other team who is running a Reinhardt and a Zarya. You're basically going in 1 versus 2. However, in this mode, if you're finding that you're being overwhelmed with one character, then you can just switch to another and try a different strategy without having to worry about convincing the other tank on your team to switch as well. I'll talk more about that towards the end of the video, but overall, I thought it was a better experience for the tank player in this system than the current 2-2-2. I did, however, notice a very big problem with having only 1 tank, and that comes from long-duration crowd control abilities. Things like Sombra's Hack or Ana's Sleep Dart are substantially more powerful when the enemy team only has 1 tank. Normally, if Reinhardt gets hacked, then Zarya or D.Va can help compensate, but having the only tank not able to move or use abilities for 5 seconds or longer is just way too strong. Because of this, if Blizzard was ever to implement a 1 tank role queue system, then I think it would be absolutely necessary to make it so that all the characters in the tank role have reduced duration on any crowd control effects. I would cut it by 50%. After all, they're tanks, and you would expect them to be more resistant against these sorts of things anyways. But without this change, you would probably end up seeing Sombra in 100% of the matches. That's how strong it is. Moving on to the good side of things, I think that the new system does solve one of the problems Overwatch has, in that people just don't like to play tank or support. You know, there's a reason why people want to play DPS, because it feels more rewarding. You get all the big notifications, the eliminations, the play of the games, all that sort of stuff. As the only tank player in this new mode, however, you feel a lot more powerful. You get to play a character that is very impactful in every fight. I never felt like I was just standing around holding up a barrier. It always felt like whatever I did carried a lot of weight. I know many other players would also enjoy that sort of thing, but I do understand some people may not like the extra pressure. However, in the end, I believe it will result in making more people want to play tank than less. Now, as far as the queue times go, I don't think this would have any substantial increase or impact on the queue times. Yes, I think more people would want to play tank, but it's not going to be so drastic that it's going to double or triple the queue time. Moving on to the DPS, the best strategy in Overwatch has and probably always will be to stay as a group. However, in this new game mode, it appears that a lot of the DPS I saw playing were treating it more like a solo player deathmatch rather than trying to work as a team. This is not a fault with the new game mode itself, but rather that just those DPS weren't playing properly. All the times when my team did stay together, we almost always won the match pretty easily. Maybe it's just because it's an experimental mode and not a real competitive, that some of those DPS players just don't care if they end up losing, so they just kind of go off and do their own thing. It's not like they're going to lose any SR from it. If this was made into a real competitive mode, I have no doubt whatsoever that the upper bracket players would stay together far more often, and all those DPS that refuse to work with their teammates to group up would inevitably drop in rank. It might be frustrating at first, but it's one of those things that I have no doubt it would eventually sort itself out. However, the biggest concern I have for the new game mode has to do with the supports. I noticed some of them were having a significantly more difficult time. They're much more vulnerable now, and those that don't have good damage output or reliable escape or defense mechanisms are in a lot of trouble. With only one tank, it is difficult or even impossible to reliably peel for your support players. This now falls onto the other DPS characters to do instead. Perhaps it's because it's a new game mode and people haven't adapted enough, but that previously mentioned DPS problem where they tend to do their own thing, well, that hurts the support players even more because of it. When a support player needs someone to peel for them, it just isn't there. Certain tanks like Zarya can always turn around to try to bubble them, or D.Va can fly in with defense matrix, but a solo Reinhardt or an Irisa, there just isn't anything you can do. If this game was to move forward, then Blizzard would absolutely need to rethink many of the support heroes in addition to the tanks. This includes not just buffs and more damage, but also new abilities for them. One final thing I want to go over before we get into the individual characters. Blizzard, if you're listening, in regard to the one tank role queue system specifically, I think you should give some very serious consideration to moving a few of the DPS characters into that role. Kind of like the reverse of what you were going to do with Roadhog when you were thinking about moving him into DPS. Mei already functions more like a tank than she does a DPS. Think about it. She's got an ability to protect her team from damage, she has very good spacing and area control, she also has high sustainability, she also has crowd control. I mean, these kind of things feel a lot more at home with a tank than a DPS to me. I don't think it would require a whole lot of effort to just move her into an effective tank role position. Alright, so now let's talk about the individual characters in the tank role, because some of them work and some of them don't. So first up is D.Va. I gotta tell you, it feels amazing not to be demacked in less than 3 seconds. The combination of the armor and the new defense matrix works great. You can now sit in front of your team and actually tank for them if you're running a more standard lineup. It's not as good as Reinhardt with the barrier, but it still works. Using D.Va in a dive comp is even better. There are still weaknesses to heroes with beam weapons, which makes Zarya a very solid counter pick to her, but overall, D.Va feels really good to use, and I think that in a one tank system, she's in a pretty good spot. Next up is Irisa. The changes for this character were pretty minor. I think that all of the nerfs that she's been getting in the recent patches did quite a bit to bring her down, and unfortunately, even with the extra stuff that she got for this particular game mode, it just doesn't seem like it's enough. From what I saw, it was pretty easy to just overrun the Irisa when she doesn't have another tank to back her up. However, the halt ability is now even more useful due to the lack of enemy barriers and other defensive abilities. It's definitely easier to grab several enemies at once, so that can be even more powerful of a tool than it was before. I also want to point out that the new game mode really shines a light on just how lackluster Irisa's ultimate is. Now, I'm definitely not saying that it's worthless or anything, but compared to the other tank ultimates, it just doesn't feel like it has the same kind of oomph to it. I think Irisa needs something a little bit more in order to have a spot as the only tank. Moving on to Reinhardt, this is an interesting one because he can be played defensively or aggressively in the current version of the game, depending on what your team is using. He often relies on Zarya or D.Va for engagements as backup. However, in this mode, you're on your own. It's a bit weird because you do more damage with your primary attack, so you want to get in close in order to get those attacks and build your ultimate quickly, but you also don't have the benefit of that bubble of the defense matrix when your barrier's down. This is where Mei is incredibly powerful. As I mentioned, she already functions kinda like a tank, so if you use her as your unofficial off-tank for Reinhardt, then he becomes incredibly powerful. Using the Ice Wall to provide that extra protection while Reinhardt recharges his shield is just one of the things that you can do. Overall, I think Reinhardt is pretty solid as a solo tank, but his core design suffers from not having the backup off-tank. I think maybe increasing his speed a little bit more when he is holding his barrier up might be the way to go. Otherwise, it feels like you're almost just required to have a Lucio when you only have the Reinhardt. Next up is Roadhog. One of the biggest problems with this character is he has always been an ultimate battery. You could limit this a little bit by having an Irisa or a Reinhardt provide a barrier, but when Roadhog is by himself, he absolutely is just a massive ultimate battery. I've talked about this before, and I think it's worth mentioning again. Maybe if Roadhog had a passive that simply lowered the amount of ultimate charge he gave, might be enough to offset that. I'm not saying that it would reduce the damage, just the amount of ultimate charge that other players get when they're attacking him. On the plus side, however, having the hook on a very low cooldown is incredibly powerful, even with Roadhog's new reduced damage. Because the enemy team is only going to have one tank, then they're much less likely to have that barrier in the way to block it. It means that landing those hooks will happen quite often, and that's pretty strong. The new Take a Breather ability, not so much though. It feels kind of awkward, and it's not as effective as maybe it was originally intended to be. The first part of it is that you need to use the ability in order to heal yourself, since you have no other defense mechanisms at all. No barrier, no defense matrix, no nothing. You're kind of just standing out there, taking huge amounts of damage, and you need to have that Take a Breather in order to heal yourself up. However, the ability is also used as your protective thing, defensive measure, to keep your teammates up. So it's not uncommon to use the ability even when you already have most of your health, just to help out reduce the damage on your teammates. It's like if Zarya had to use her bubble, but it activated on both her and her teammate at the same time. Usually only one or the other is going to be needed, so having it go on both of them at the same time just seems like a waste. In addition, the damage resistance that your team gets is on the low side. Keep in mind, your teammates need to be inside the area of effect, which is usually going to be in the open, where they're going to take lots of damage. It's not like a barrier that blocks 100% of the damage. This ability is only going to block a small amount of it. To put it simply, standing in the open is one of the worst things that you can possibly do. Even if you have this effect that reduces incoming damage by 25%, it's still a terrible idea. Yes, there are going to be situations where it can be useful, where it's unavoidable that your team is just kind of in the open, but you should always try to do your best to not be in those situations. It's always going to be a better choice to just move off to the side and try to take cover behind a wall. I guess what I'm trying to say is that this just doesn't feel like a main tank defensive ability. It feels like something an off tank would have, and it just isn't sufficient when you only have one tank. I think if Roadhog was going to stay as the only tank, then he would need to have a damage reduction or a mitigation tool that's better than what he currently has. Next up is Sigma. This guy has been nerfed so many times. I don't think that the small changes he got are going to be good enough to put him into a main tank role. Even with these buffs, even with these changes that he just got, I would still consider him to be an off tank. I feel like one of the problems with Sigma is that the character can just do way too much stuff. I think Blizzard should focus on making one of his defensive abilities really good, and the other one can just be kind of something extra. Because right now, rather than having one good ability and one just, okay ability, he has just a whole bunch of mediocre abilities. I mean, that can be said for most of his kit as well, because he has so much stuff, it all has to be nerfed down into mediocrity in order to have some semblance of balance. And he just isn't really good enough at anything. He doesn't feel like he's in a position even remotely close to be the only tank on the team. If you need a barrier, then you run Reinhardt. If you need something to deal with the hit scan and projectile, then you're way better off running D.Va. Next up is Winston. He plays mostly the same that you would have before, but like Reinhardt, you don't have the benefit of a backup tank, namely D.Va in most cases. The extra armor does help during the fight, but the reduced cooldown on the barrier is nice, and it helps you to re-engage more quickly, but it doesn't help you during the current fight that you're in. I find that now the enemy team has 3 DPS, the barrier gets destroyed much faster. Basically, you engage with the leap, drop the barrier, and then the barrier gets destroyed before your leap is ever off cooldown, which means that you're just kind of hanging out there, waiting for leap to be available again, and because you don't have the benefit of another tank to help, you're a lot more vulnerable. Maybe reducing the cooldown on the leap by a small amount or possibly increasing the health on the barrier might help deal with this situation. He's not exactly terrible, but he could definitely use a little bit more. Next up is Hammond. He's the only character in the tank role that didn't get any changes. I think this is because, for the most part, he was designed to be kind of a solo tank to begin with. The problem is he provides absolutely no protection to his team whatsoever. Even Roadhog provides some protection, even if it's not the greatest. Without the ability to provide at least some kind of damage mitigation, the DPS with Hammond are more limited than with other tanks. You need to use characters that work at either extreme long distance or require very little in the way of protecting, like a Tracer or a Genji. There are some characters that you just can't use with a Hammond as your only tank. I want to throw out an idea here. You don't necessarily need to provide a barrier or damage resistance to your team. Instead, you could have an ability that just reduces the damage of the enemy team. What if Hammond applied a damage reduction debuff to the enemy players? Let's say whenever he hits them at high speed, or maybe whenever he hits them with a pile driver. Make it so that Hammond still plays the same way that Hammond has always been played, but now he would be able to provide at least some sort of protection and damage mitigation to his team, albeit it would be in the form of reducing the enemy team damage instead of just providing barriers. This wouldn't work with the 2-2-2 system, I don't think, but if he's the only tank, I think it would actually be quite good. Another problem with Hammond in the new game mode is that enemy players are much more split up than they were before. This means that Hammond's adaptive shield is a lot worse, because there just aren't going to be that many enemies in an area grouped up. You can't get that extra shielding. So maybe instead have the adaptive shield give more per hero, but have it capped like what happens with Sigma's kinetic grasp. Overall though, in the current system, Hammond just tends to be a pretty terrible pick as the only tank. The last character on the list is Zarya. She has potential to be quite powerful, provided that your team is actually staying together. However, one of the issues that I did notice is that it can sometimes be more difficult to build your damage charge before. The reason for this is because previously, you would have that Reinhardt in front of you, and you could just throw a bubble on him, kind of like clockwork, and constantly build your damage charge while keeping him protected. A Reinhardt that gets the bubble knows that he can drop his barrier, absorb the damage, and allows him to attack a little bit. But if the bubble gets destroyed, he's not really concerned because he can quickly raise his barrier, and then he, in general, just has lots of health and armor to survive any incoming damage. However, if the only other people on your team are the squishies, the DPS, and the supports, then it's a lot more difficult to get them to use the bubble to the full potential because they don't want to stand in the open and take the damage. They don't have Reinhardt's barrier or the extra health and armor that he has, and if the bubble gets destroyed, well, they're going to be in trouble. So it's more difficult to kind of coerce them into taking the damage, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Additionally, Zarya is going to be out in front most of the time since you don't have that Reinhardt conveniently in front of you, which means that in order to use the bubble on your teammates, you often have to turn around and look behind you. This wasn't such a big deal before when, again, you had the Reinhardt barrier protecting you in the front, but now it's, I don't know, it's a little more awkward, right? Don't get me wrong, the AoE bubble effect is awesome if your team is grouped up and moving together, but in general, using the projected barrier and building your damage charge seems more awkward. Okay, so final thoughts on everything. Overall, I believe that the new game mode was pretty fun and it works significantly better than I thought it would, but there are definitely some pretty big flaws in that system. A lot of the tanks would need to be readjusted and balanced a little bit better, going over what I was mentioning, some of those problems before. The supports would definitely need some help because they're just going to be in a bad position. I wouldn't worry too much about the DPS because, again, I think it'll just sort itself out. People will adapt and learn. I definitely think that moving some of those DPS into the tank role would also be a good idea. And for the tank queue times, again, not really worried about it. I think that overall, yeah, I think that this system could possibly work with 1 tank, 3 DPS, and 2 supports, but it's going to need a lot more changes. Not just those tanks, but other stuff as well. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to see more, make sure you subscribe and hit that bell to get notified. You can get some cool gear, join my Discord server, or follow me on social media with the links down in the description below. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters, and remember, always blame the controller because it's never your fault.